They say grief has a way of leaving a door open inside you, a door you never quite managed to close all the way. Wind blows through it on quiet nights, and you sit by the fire and you feel it, that cold draft of everything that used to be and isn't anymore. I had been living with that open door for 11 months when Cole Aldridge rode back into my life. And I want you to understand something before I tell you what he tried to do to me. I loved that boy. God help me. I loved him like he had come from my own body. His name was Cole Aldridge. He was Thomas's son from his first marriage, the one that ended when Cole was just 4 years old and his mother, Nora, went to her reward from a fever that swept through Waco like a judgment from the Lord. Thomas raised Cole alone for 6 years before I came into the picture. I was 26 when I married Thomas Aldridge, a widow myself by then. My first husband, a kind but frail man named Robert Doyle, had died of consumption 2 years prior. Thomas was 40, broad-shouldered, slow to speak and quicker to listen than any man I ever knew. Cole was 10. He had his father's eyes, that particular shade of gray that seemed to hold weather in them, and his mother's restlessness, which Thomas always spoke of with a kind of tender sadness. For 12 years we were a family on the AA Ranch, 40 miles east of Abilene. Thomas built that ranch from nothing, from cracked dirt and a dream, and the kind of stubbornness that either builds empires or breaks men in half. He built it into something real. 400 acres of good Texas grass, a main house with a cedar plank porch, a proper barn, 3 working wells, and a bunkhouse that held up to 6 hands. Cole grew up on those 40 acres before it became 400. He learned to ride on that land, learned to rope, learned to read by lantern light at the kitchen table where I sat beside him and pointed at the words. When Cole was 23, there was a falling out. I won't say it was nobody's fault, because it was partly Thomas's, partly Cole's, and maybe partly mine for not doing more to bridge the distance between them. It had to do with a woman in Abilene that Cole wanted to marry, a girl named Della Pruitt, whose father ran a gambling house and whose reputation was, let us say, complicated. Thomas forbade it. Cole said some things that cannot be unsaid. Thomas said some back. Cole rode off on a Tuesday morning in April of 1882, and I stood on that cedar porch and watched him go, and something in my chest folded inward like paper in a flame. We heard from him twice in the first year. A letter from San Antonio saying he was working the cattle drives. A Christmas card in 1883 with no return address. Then nothing. 5 years of nothing. Thomas died in September of 1886. His heart. He was out checking the north fence line on a hot afternoon, and he just sat down in the grass and didn't get back up again. Our ranch hand Eli Beaumont found him there, hat still on his head, hands folded in his lap like a man who had decided to rest and chosen his moment deliberately. I was 57 years old, and I was alone on 400 acres of Texas, and the man who had been the fixed point of my entire adult life was gone. I want you to understand the particular loneliness of that autumn. The land is beautiful in September in Texas. The grasses go gold, and the sky gets that deep, merciless blue, and beauty without anyone to show it to is almost worse than ugliness. Eli stayed on. He was 61, a lean and weathered black man who had worked the AA for 9 years, who knew every fence post and every quirk of every well on that property, and who grieved Thomas in his own quiet way, by working harder. I was grateful for Eli in ways I still cannot fully put into words. I wrote to Cole. I found an address in San Antonio, through a mutual acquaintance, a cattle broker named Hutchins who occasionally passed through Abilene. I wrote Cole that his father had died and that the ranch was his to come home to, if he wanted to come home. I meant it sincerely. Thomas had left the ranch to me in his will, legally, without question, filed properly with the Taylor County Deed Office in 1879, but I wrote Cole that I hoped we might work the land together, as family, the way Thomas would have wanted. Cole did not write back. Not for 2 months. And then, instead of a letter, Cole came himself. I remember the morning clearly because the weather had turned cold overnight, that first real cold snap of October, and I was on the porch with a cup of coffee watching the frost on the grass melt in the morning sun, thinking about Thomas, thinking about the north well that needed its pump leather replaced before winter. I heard horses on the road. Not one horse, but several. And I set my cup down and stood up straight and shielded my eyes against the low morning light. Cole looked older. Of course he did. He was 28 now, not 23, but it wasn't just age. There was a tightness around his jaw that hadn't been there before, a way of holding his shoulders that suggested calculation rather than confidence. He was dressed well, better than a cattle hand ought to be dressed. Beside him rode two other men. One I didn't know, a heavy-set fellow in a town suit, and the other was our county sheriff, Walt Greer, who had held that office for 6 years and who Thomas had always said was the kind of man who knew which way the wind was blowing and dressed accordingly. Cole pulled up at the gate and looked at me for a long moment before he dismounted. There was something in his face that I wanted desperately to read as grief, as the face of a son returning to his father's land with sorrow in his heart. But it wasn't quite that. It was something careful, something rehearsed. "Martha," he said.
"Cole," I said.
I came down off the porch. We did not embrace. The man in the town suit introduced himself as Gerald Vance, attorney at law, out of San Antonio. He had a leather satchel that he held with both hands, and he was already reaching into it before I had finished shaking his hand, and that told me everything I needed to know about what kind of visit this was going to be. Sheriff Walt Greer touched the brim of his hat. He did not meet my eyes. Gerald Vance produced a set of papers. He spoke in the smooth, practiced cadence of a man accustomed to delivering bad news in a tone that implied good news. He said that he was there on behalf of Cole Aldridge, the sole legitimate heir of Thomas Aldridge, deceased, and that he had in his possession a deed of property transfer, dated March 12, 1881, signed by Thomas Aldridge, conveying the entirety of the AA ranch to his son, Cole Aldridge, to take effect upon Thomas Aldridge's death. I stood there in the cold October air, and I looked at those papers, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Not because I believed them, but because I suddenly understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, the architecture of what was happening. Cole hadn't come home to grieve. Cole had come home to collect. I kept my face still. Thomas had taught me that actually he used to say that a poker face wasn't dishonest, it was just a way of buying time to think. I kept my face still, and I said that I would need to examine those documents, and I would need to speak with my own counsel, and in the meantime I would thank them to remain off my property. Cole looked at me with those gray weather-holding eyes, and something moved through them. Something that might have been shame, if shame were a language he still spoke. "Martha," he said quietly, "this doesn't have to be hard." I looked at him for a long moment. "You rode 5 years away without a word to your dying father," I said. "And now you've come back with a lawyer and a sheriff and papers I've never seen before, and you want to tell me what doesn't have to be hard. Go on back to Abilene, Cole. I'll send word when I'm ready to talk." I walked back into my house and shut the door and stood with my back against it in the dim hallway, and I shook. Not from fear. From something colder than fear, something that had no good name for it. The particular grief of watching someone you love choose to become a person you don't recognize. Eli was in the kitchen. He had heard everything through the window, which he had cracked open, not from nosiness, but from the habit of a man who had learned that it was better to know things than not to know them. He looked at me and said nothing. "Make some coffee," I said. "We need to think." Now, I want to tell you about Gerald Vance's papers, because they were good. I mean that in the way you might grudgingly acknowledge a forgery, they were crafted with real care. The deed was properly formatted, appropriately aged, and bore what appeared to be Thomas's signature. The date, March 12, 1881, was plausible. Cole would have been 22 then, before the falling out. A father, one might argue, transferring property to his son while the relationship was still warm. But there were things that didn't sit right with me, and they came to me slowly, the way things do when you're not panicking but simply paying attention. Thomas had been meticulous about his papers. Every deed, every contract, every bill of sale. He kept them in a metal strongbox in the bedroom closet, and he reviewed them every year in January, the way another man might prune a garden. I had gone through that strongbox after his death. I knew everything in it. There was no deed from 1881 conveying anything to Cole. The second thing that troubled me was the notary's seal on Vance's document. I had squinted at it on the porch, just for a moment, before handing it back. The seal bore the name of a notary in San Antonio, a city where Thomas had been, yes, on cattle business in 1881, but where he had had no reason to file property documents since our deed was registered in Taylor County, where the land sat. I told Eli these things. He listened with his elbows on the kitchen table and his long fingers wrapped around his coffee cup, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Mr. Thomas kept his Bible on the nightstand. Never moved it. You look in there?" I had not looked in there. I had been unable to go into the bedroom much since September. I had been sleeping in the small room off the kitchen that we used to call the spare room, unable to bear the particular emptiness of the bed where Thomas had slept for 18 years. I got up and went into the bedroom. The Bible was where it always was, on the nightstand, a thick black King James edition with Thomas's name stamped in gold on the cover, the gold worn mostly off by now. I sat on the edge of the bed, the first time I had sat on it since the funeral, and I picked up the Bible and held it for a moment. It smelled like him, cedar and leather, and something underneath that was just Thomas, just the particular alive smell of the man, still somehow present in the pages. I opened it. Thomas had the habit, which I had always found endearing, of tucking things in his Bible. Not randomly, he had a system, though I had never fully understood it. Prayer cards at the front. Important dates written in the margins in his careful, small handwriting. And documents, real documents, the kind he considered too important even for the strongbox, tucked into the pages of whatever book of scripture seemed relevant to their nature. In the Book of Ruth, which Thomas had told me once was his favorite book of the Bible, for its story of loyalty and belonging, I found a folded sheet of paper. It was thicker paper than you usually see, the quality paper used by county deed offices, with the official stamp of Taylor County, Texas, in the upper right corner. It was dated January 7th, 1879. It was the original deed to the AA Ranch, granted to Thomas William Aldridge and Martha Jean Aldridge, husband and wife, joint proprietors, to be held in common and to pass in its entirety to the surviving spouse upon the death of either party. I sat on that bed, and I read it 3 times. The language was clear. The notarization was legitimate. I recognized the seal of Harold Sims, who had been the Taylor County notary in 1879 and who had died in 1884, but whose seal was, I knew, registered and verifiable in the county records. There was no mechanism in this document by which Thomas could have transferred the property to Cole unilaterally in 1881. Any such transfer would have required my signature. The joint proprietorship was indivisible without my consent. Cole's deed was either a forgery of Thomas's signature, or Thomas had been deceived into signing something whose nature was misrepresented to him, or, and this seemed most likely, the document had been fabricated entirely after Thomas's death. I folded the deed from Ruth and put it in my apron pocket and sat there on Thomas's side of the bed for a long time, with his Bible in my lap, and I had 2 feelings simultaneously that should not have been able to coexist but did, a hot, clear-eyed fury, and a grief so profound it felt like a second bereavement. Because Cole had done this. Cole, the boy I had taught to read, who had sat at my kitchen table and worked through his letters with his tongue between his teeth in concentration, who had once, at age 13, brought me a handful of wildflowers when I was ill in bed. Cole had come back to his father's land, not to mourn but to steal. I went back to the kitchen and told Eli what I had found. He looked at the deed for a long time without speaking, and then he set it down on the table very carefully, like it was something that could shatter. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pushing dry leaves across the yard with a sound like whispered warnings, and the oil lamp on the kitchen table swayed just slightly in a draft from under the door and made our shadows move on the wall behind us. "Well," Eli said at last. "Well," I said. He picked up the deed again and looked at the notary seal, the real one, the Taylor County seal I had known for 18 years, and then he set it down again. "You know what Mr. Thomas used to say," he said. "He used to say a man's word was his deed, and his deed was his word, and the 2 things ought to match up or neither one was worth much." He folded his hands on the table. "Whoever made that other paper, they understood that a deed carries weight. They just forgot that weight falls both ways." I thought about that for a moment. Outside, a horse shifted in the barn, and the weather vane above the roof swung and creaked. The ranch breathed around us the way it always did, indifferent to the human dramas being conducted inside its walls. "We need a lawyer," I said. "We need the right lawyer," I said. There was only one lawyer in Abilene whose judgment I trusted, and that was a woman, which was remarkable in 1887, though she would have told you it was less remarkable than it should have been. Her name was Frances Holbrook, and she had passed the Texas bar through the firm of her late husband, who had trained her, and she had continued practicing after his death in 1884 with a particular ferocity that I had always admired. She was 44, small-boned and quick-eyed, and she had the quality that I have always valued most in a person under pressure, which is the ability to be completely calm while moving very fast. Eli drove me into Abilene in the wagon the next morning, and I brought the Bible and the deed and a letter I had written out by lamplight the night before, laying out everything I knew and everything I suspected. Frances Holbrook read it all without interrupting me, in her small office above the hardware store, with the October wind rattling the window in its frame and the smell of sawdust and machine oil coming up through the floorboards. When I finished, she set the papers down and looked at me. "The joint proprietorship deed supersedes any subsequent transfer," she said. "You cannot unilaterally convey jointly held property. It's settled Texas law. If their 1881 document is genuine, and I very much doubt it is, it would still be void on its face, because your signature isn't on it and your signature was required." "Can we prove the forgery?" "We can do better than that," she said. "We can make them prove the authenticity. The burden of proof is on the party asserting the later document. They have to establish its legitimacy. We simply have to demonstrate that the original deed exists and is prior and controlling."
She paused.
"But I want to warn you about something." "Walt Greer," I said. "Walt Greer," she agreed. Sheriff Greer had already filed a notice with the county clerk's office. Cole had moved quickly, indicating that there was a competing claim to the AA property and that until the matter was resolved, Martha Aldrich should be considered to have only a provisional right of occupancy. It was not legally meaningful in itself, but it was a signal, and Frances and I both understood what it signaled. Walt Greer had already decided which way this particular wind was blowing, and he had pointed himself in Cole's direction. I said, "How do we get in front of a judge who isn't in Cole's pocket?" Frances said, "That's the right question. Judge Harlan Pitt holds the district court. He's not in anyone's pocket, exactly, but he is old-fashioned, and old-fashioned in this context means he may have a disposition to believe that a son inheriting from a father is the natural order of things." She tapped her fingers on the desk. "We need to be very precise, very prepared. We go in with everything documented, everything cross-referenced. We don't give him room to exercise his sympathies." Cole filed his formal legal claim 9 days later. The hearing was set for November 3rd at the Taylor County Courthouse in Abilene. I had 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks were the strangest of my life, stranger even than the weeks after Thomas died, because at least then the pain was simple. Now the pain was complicated by having to function, having to think, having to catalog documents and write statements and answer Frances Holbrook's precise and sometimes uncomfortable questions about the exact nature of Thomas's relationship with Cole, the history of the falling out, the names of anyone who might have witnessed any interaction between Thomas and Gerald Vance or Cole in 1881. I slept badly. I worked the ranch by day. The cattle didn't stop needing tending because I was in legal peril, and I sat up with Frances's papers by night, the oil lamp burning low on the kitchen table, while the Texas dark pressed flat and total against the windows, and the coyotes called from somewhere out past the north pasture. There is a particular quality to that kind of night work, when the stakes are high and the hours are slow. The lamp gives everything amber edges. The papers in front of you become almost sacred objects, each word carrying freight you can feel. I read Thomas's original deed so many times in those 3 weeks that I could have recited it from memory in my sleep, and on the nights when sleep finally came, brief and shallow, I dreamed of the words themselves: joint proprietors, surviving spouse, Taylor County, Texas, swimming in amber lamplight against the dark. Eli was steadfast throughout in a way that moved me almost to tears on several occasions. He drove me to Abilene twice more for meetings with Frances. He took over the heavier ranch work without being asked. And one evening, sitting on the porch after supper while the coyotes started up in the distance, He told me something that mattered. He said that in late August, a few weeks before Thomas died, a man had ridden out to the ranch on a weekday afternoon when I had been in town with the wagon. Cole had not been with this man. The man had been alone. He had introduced himself as a land surveyor sent by the county to update property records. Eli had been suspicious, but had stayed close while the man walked the fence lines and looked at the well locations and asked detailed questions about the property boundaries. The man had been on the ranch for about 2 hours before Thomas had come back from the north pasture and spoken to him briefly and sent him away. Thomas had seemed unsettled after the man left, Eli said. He had gone inside and spent a long time in the bedroom. Eli hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, with everything that had happened since, it sat differently. Do you remember what this man looked like? I asked. Eli described him. Heavy-set, dark suit, ink stains on his right hand from habitual writing, a way of smiling that didn't involve his eyes. It was Gerald Vance. I wrote this down and brought it to Frances. Her expression didn't change, but something sharpened behind her eyes. He was surveying the property, she said, getting what he needed to make the forged deed credible, accurate boundary descriptions, water source locations. Details that would make a fabricated 1881 document look legitimate. She paused. And if Thomas saw him here, Thomas may have known something was being planned. He may have deliberately put that deed in his Bible where he knew you'd eventually find it.
I had to sit down when she said that,
because I had already half-thought it and been afraid to let the thought complete itself. Thomas, knowing he was not well, his heart had been giving him warning signs for months, small ones, a shortness of breath, a tiredness he didn't speak of, but that showed in how he moved. Thomas in those final weeks, putting the deed somewhere safe, somewhere only I would look. Thomas, who had always known me better than I knew myself. The courthouse in Abilene was a 2-story sandstone building on the main square, with tall narrow windows and a flagpole out front and wooden benches inside that had been polished by decades of anxious sitting. It smelled of lamp oil and wood dust and old paper. On the morning of November 3rd, a Thursday, the sky was the color of pewter, and there was a north wind carrying the smell of distant rain. I wore my best dress, the dark blue one with the black collar, and I carried Thomas's Bible because Frances had told me to bring the original deed in the most authoritative container I owned, and that was the container Thomas had chosen. The courtroom filled up more than I expected. Word had gotten around, the way word does in a county town, and there were perhaps 30 people in the gallery. Some I knew. Most I recognized. A few I could not place. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of all that collective attention. Someone near the back had brought a child who kept whispering questions that her mother answered in urgent murmurs. 2 ranchers from the East County sat together with their arms folded in identical postures of watchful neutrality, the way men do when they are interested in the outcome but do not want to commit to appearing interested. An old woman I recognized as Mabel Giddings, who had been Thomas's neighbor in Abilene before we moved to the ranch, sat in the front row of the gallery with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes fixed forward with the expression of a woman prepared to see justice done or make considerable noise about it afterward. Cole sat at a table to my left with Gerald Vance, both of them in good suits, both of them arranged in postures of confident ease. Cole did not look at me when I came in. He looked at the window. Judge Harlan Pitt was 67 years old, white-haired and deliberate, with the weathered face of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors before spending the rest of it in courtrooms. He was known for 2 things, an absolute intolerance for wasted time and a genuine, old-fashioned respect for documentary evidence over oral testimony, on the grounds that documents didn't change their stories depending on who was asking. Frances knew this about him. Frances had chosen her entire strategy around this. Gerald Vance presented first. He was smooth and prepared, and he laid out Cole's claim methodically. He entered the 1881 deed as evidence, spoke eloquently about Thomas Aldridge's intentions for his son and heir, and implied, not quite said, but implied, that Martha Aldridge's continued occupation of the property was an act of grief-driven stubbornness that stood against the clear documentary record of Thomas's wishes. He was good. I sat there and watched him work, and I thought, without malice, "You are a skilled man, Mr. Vance, and you have put real craft into this." Then Frances Holbrook rose. She spoke quietly. She had a way of speaking that made rooms lean toward her, not because she was loud, but because she was precise. Every sentence she spoke had exactly the weight it needed, and not a syllable more. She entered the 1879 deed. She drew the court's attention to the joint proprietorship language. She quoted the relevant statute from the Texas Property Code. She explained, with the calm patience of someone who genuinely enjoys clarity, that any subsequent transfer of jointly held marital property required both signatures, and that the 1881 document bore only Thomas Aldridge's signature, which made it void on its face regardless of its authenticity. Then she addressed the authenticity. She had done something in those 3 weeks that I had not known about because she hadn't wanted to raise my hopes prematurely. She had written to the notary board in San Antonio and requested the registry records for the notary whose seal appeared on the 1881 deed. The notary's name was listed on the document as one Arthur P. Colm. The San Antonio Notary Registry had no record of any Arthur P. Colm ever being commissioned in that county or any adjacent county, or anywhere in the state of Texas. She entered the letter from the notary board. She then entered Eli Beaumont's written statement about the visit of Gerald Vance to the AA Ranch in late August 1886, 2 weeks before Thomas Aldridge's death. She then entered a statement from a handwriting expert in Austin, a professor at the university, whose credentials she established with quiet thoroughness, who had examined a photograph of the 1881 deed and compared it to 3 known authenticated samples of Thomas Aldridge's signature on file with the Taylor County Clerk's office. The expert's conclusion was that the signature on the 1881 deed showed multiple indicators inconsistent with the other samples, including pen pressure variation and letter form differences in the capital A of Aldridge that were significant enough to indicate, in his professional opinion, that the signatures were not produced by the same hand. She entered the professor's report. The courtroom was very quiet. The north wind pushed against the tall, narrow windows. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed and let in the smell of coming rain. Judge Pitt had his reading glasses on and was working his way through Francis's documents with the methodical care of a man who had long since decided that the printed word was more reliable than the spoken kind. He was not a fast reader, and no one in that courtroom made a sound while he read. Gerald Vance tried twice to interject and was gavelled down both times.
Cole sat still.
He was looking at the table in front of him now, at his own folded hands. I watched him. I couldn't help it. I kept looking for the boy I knew in the posture of the man he'd become, and finding him, briefly, in small things, the way his right thumb moved against his left knuckle, a habitual gesture I recognized from 20 years ago, from sitting beside him at a kitchen table while he worked through difficult passages, and his frustration came out through his hands. Judge Pitt set down the final page of Francis's materials, removed his reading glasses, and cleaned them with the cloth he kept in his coat pocket. He put them back on. He looked at Gerald Vance. He said, "Counselor, I'm going to give you an opportunity to establish the authenticity of the notary seal on your client's document. I want the name, commission number, and county of registry for Arthur P. Colm by end of business today. If you cannot produce that information, I will treat the document as unverified and proceed accordingly." Vance said he would need time. Pitt said he had until 4 o'clock. At 3:45, Gerald Vance sent word through the court clerk that he was unable to produce the requested documentation. At 4:15, with the rain finally arriving and hitting the courthouse windows in long gray sheets, Judge Harlan Pitt ruled that the 1881 deed was inadmissible on grounds of unverified notarization and void in any case under Texas joint property law, that the 1879 deed was the controlling legal document, and that Martha Jean Aldridge was the sole and lawful owner of the AA Ranch. Cole left without speaking to me. I sat in that courtroom after everyone else had filed out, with Thomas's Bible in my lap and the rain on the windows, and I tried to understand what I felt. Relief, yes. Vindication, yes. But these were surface things, and underneath them was something heavier and more complicated, something I am still carrying now, months later, and expect to carry for the rest of my life. I had won. I had kept what was mine, what Thomas had built, what we had built together. I had outsmarted a forger and a corrupt sheriff and an attorney who had gambled on my grief, making me slow. I had done it with my wits and with an old deed folded into the Book of Ruth, and with the help of a lawyer who never lost her calm and a ranch hand who paid attention to things. But Cole was my stepson. He had been 10 years old when I first held his hand crossing the street in Abilene. He had been 12 when he got his first horse and come tearing across the south pasture at a gallop, his gray eyes wide with joy, and I had stood on the porch and laughed out loud at the sight of him. He had been 23 when he rode away in anger, and I watched him go and felt that folding inward, that paper in a flame. I do not know what happened to him in those 5 years. I do not know what shape his grief took after his father died, whether it was sharp or complicated or whether it had curdled into something else by then, something harder, something that Gerald Vance and his leather satchel had been able to walk into and inhabit. I do not know if Cole believed at some level that what he was doing was a kind of justice, that Thomas had owed him more than he received, that I had taken something that should have come to him. I do not know if he is capable of that degree of self-justification, or whether he knew, clearly and fully, that he was attempting a fraud and chose to proceed anyway. Francis filed a complaint against Gerald Vance with the Texas bar. Sheriff Walt Greer lost the next election, in the spring of 1887, to a younger man who had served as a deputy in Lubbock and whose primary campaign argument was, essentially, that he was not Walt Greer. I heard that Vance left San Antonio and opened a practice in New Mexico Territory, which I suppose meant that he found a geography more suited to his particular legal style. Cole sent me a letter in February. It was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph said he was sorry. The second paragraph tried to explain, and I will not reproduce the explanation here, because explanations for some things are less useful than the simple fact of the apology. The third paragraph asked if there was any chance we might speak. I have been sitting with that letter for a long time. I keep it in Thomas's Bible now, tucked into Proverbs, which seemed right. There are a great many verses in Proverbs about the uses of wisdom, and also about the ways that foolish choices compound themselves, and also, if you read it in a certain light, about the possibility of turning back. I have not written back yet. I don't know if I will. There are some doors that, once shut, cannot be opened from either side without changing the frame of the house. And there are others that simply need time, that need the wind to die down and the dust to settle, and for both people to stand on opposite sides for a while and breathe, just breathe, until it becomes possible to think about turning the handle. What I know is this: the AA ranch is mine. The grass is coming back green after a good winter rain. The north well has its new pump leather and draws water clean and cold. Eli is replacing the barn roof this week, and I can hear him up there in the mornings, the steady rhythm of his hammer against the planks, and I bring him coffee at 10 o'clock and we stand for a moment in the cold morning air looking out at the pasture where the cattle are grazing, and the light comes in low and gold across the grass, and neither of us says anything, because there is nothing that needs to be said. Thomas is in this land. He is in every fence post and every well, in the grain of the cedar planks on the porch, in the very direction of the grass where it leans away from the prevailing wind. And I am in it too, now 18 years of me and more to come. Whatever else happened, whatever was taken and whatever was kept and whatever remains unresolved in the book of Proverbs on my nightstand, I am still here. The land is mine. The morning is mine. And if there is grief in that, and there is always grief, there is also something that feels on the good mornings like something close to peace. I am Martha Jean Aldridge. I am 58 years old. And I am still standing on my porch.